Hi, I go by the Duet Ninja, and I'll be on that bullshit.
Word to the wise. If you feel as if the world revolves around you, then you must fail to realize the galaxy is never bigger than the universe. Understand your orbit before you get too close to the fucking sun.
Niggas acting bad, but somebody gotta do it. Got my foot up on the gas, but somebody gotta do it. Turn this TV off, turn this TV off. Turn this TV off, turn this TV off. Turn this TV off, turn this TV off.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Duet Ninja Dojo Live. I go by the Duet Ninja. Ladies and gentlemen, I explain shit. We'll get started here in about 7 minutes, so stay tuned, hang out. Glad you're here.
Warriors, the powers they hold are legendary.
Do you know what it's like to fall down a hill of grenades with a pin pulled? You're about to find out. Fuck were you thinking?
That although Trump was president during the charged conspiracies, his scheme was a fundamentally private one. Smith also laying out new details about Trump's conduct and conversations in the days and hours before his supporters stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021.
Everything is so beautiful. I wanna drop it down low. Everything is so beautiful. I wanna drop it down low. Everything is so beautiful. I wanna drop it down low. Everything is so.
I go by the Duet Ninja. I explain shit.
Let's talk about the Duet Ninja for a second.
And to think I hate. Well, that's very telling. Talking about demographics and the facts based on demographics, i.e. who voted for who in this situation, clearly points to the fact that being Hey guys, today's topic, by the way, and again, we're not getting started just yet. But today's topic, by the way, is about the terminology known as chattel, C-H-A-T-T-E-L, chattel slavery, the period versus chattel slavery, the noun, the concept, so to say, from a individual standpoint, the history of and what it means in terms of, obviously, relationship between societies, cultures, and more specifically, quote unquote, what is known as race, quote unquote. Okay, cool. Just want to give you guys a heads up. Stay tuned. It being categorized is something that is very real. So clearly, first and foremost, you think I'm dividing the country again. Whew, a whole lot of privilege in that statement. But you think I hate simply because I'm agreeing with a young lady who was talking about the basic breakdown, not only about DEI, but for the fact that Trump was voted in by a certain group of people, overwhelmingly. So what's your problem? Why are you so angry? Welcome to the Dojo, ladies and gentlemen. We'll start it here in a few minutes. Stay tuned. Hi, I go by the Duet Ninja. I explain shit. I'm going to talk to you about something. And this goes in line with these ridiculous individuals, especially on the Republican side, that constantly talk about debt, constantly talking about running this country like a business and not understanding what it takes to be a leader of a business, especially one that goes above and beyond their contribution to the community, because they realize the community is the only reason why they exist. You see, ladies and gentlemen, you can't run a government like a business, especially when we're talking about a democratic society based on a republic. You cannot run a fucking country like a business. And it just bugs the hell out of me that this country, especially, people are saying this when on the flip side, the way businesses have ran in this country, those who ran a lot of the businesses in this country have been doing things unethically. You can clearly see that by the wages in this country. You see, ladies and gentlemen, ethical leadership is why Musk, Trump, majority of Congress people who are getting these monies, dark money, things you can't trace, especially now. This is why everyday Americans are having a hard time with any fucking thing, because ethical leadership has never been at the center of voting people into office that wield power. Americans as a whole don't give a fuck about ethical leadership. And this is why we have individuals like this clown I'm burning right now, all on Elon's nutsacks, all on Trump's hair follicles. Well, the ones that are actually his. Let me talk to you about ethical leadership. Excuse me. Let me explain ethical leadership to you. Ethical leadership is the practice of making decisions that prioritize the common good and are based on ethical values and principles. Ethical leaders consider the needs of their employees, customers, and communities. They also encourage their teams to act ethically. What's good, folks? How you doing? I go by the Duet Ninja. I explain shit, and welcome to the live, also known as the Dojo, the Duet Ninja. I'm a former world history teacher at the high school level. I'm a dual entrepreneur, I guess you can say. I run a sound engineering business and sound engineering, voiceover, and live sound businesses. Everything is centered around creation, whether it's audio, video, production, whatever. I've been doing that for about collectively about 12 years now. And my beginning was on TikTok, as you might have seen already. And every week on Fridays, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, I come on here and I explain shit. I talk about things, and I take questions as I go. So, if ever you have time, you can hop on here on YouTube at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you have an opportunity to converse with a critical thinker, a critical questioner, and somebody who just wants the best for the world. I am a humanist. I've been one for quite a while, apparently. See, once you expand your knowledge on things and terminologies, you wind up figuring out who you are actually, and it gives you direction, gives you purpose. So, today, this is sprung off of a question in one of my TikTok videos, in the comment section, I should say, and it's centered around somebody not understanding what chattel slavery was. And as an educator, I used to say former educator, but people told me to stop saying that because how you carry yourself defines whether or not you're an educator or not, not employment status. Okay. So as an educator, I never assume people know things. So I don't mind being repetitive, and it pisses a lot of people off being repetitive, or having to repeat yourself, quote unquote, things of that nature. That doesn't bother me, because whether you're being genuine or not about your inquiry, that's not going to enhance nor dilute my ability to relay information accurately. Like I mentioned, focus. All right, so let me share the screen with you. All right, check it out. So first we're going to talk about the individual status, the key points there, the key bullets there, and then we'll move on to the period of time known as chattel slavery. Okay, so first and foremost, definition of a chattel slave. All right, so we're going to talk about the noun version. All right, a chattel slave, as highlighted here, is a person who is legally regarded as the personal property, chattel, of another individual, institution, or state. The key characteristics, blah 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 blah, of that term are thus property status, no legal personhood, permanence, and heritability. All right, those are the key characteristics of the person who is a chattel slave. All right. Property status, so they can be bought, sold, inherited, or traded just like livestock or goods. By that by that bullet point, this understanding goes way back. Right, we're talking about ancient Egypt, things of that nature. The overall premise. Now, how you were treated as a slave within these parameters is a lot different from the period of time that I'll get to in just a second. Okay, so property status, right? No legal personhood, right? So the law of that society recognizes them only as property, not as a person with rights. Now, here's the thing with that: the law also prohibits, or can prohibit, the owners of said individuals from treating them a certain way. This also is a big difference from what you saw in terms of chattel slavery, U.S.-based chattel slavery, but the period of time itself. It's not just the United States, mind you, but anyway. Permanence, right? The status is for life unless freed by the owner or by law, right? So that goes to the legal person situation I just mentioned, right? And heritability, right? Children born to chattel slaves automatically inherit the enslaved status, all right? So this is what it's like to be a chattel slave. And again, society, and the way they measure that, the way they legalize that, the parameters and how the owners can treat these individuals are the biggest factors in the difference of somebody being a chattel slave and chattel slavery, the period of time. Okay. All right. So chattel slavery, the historical period system. All right. So it's a system. And I find it funny that it's labeled as a period/system, because if you know the definition of what an ism is, the suffix ism, it's an understanding of a system, and what is attached to ism in relation to chattel slavery, racism. These are structures. These are systems. Okay. All right. Just put that out there. All right, so chattel slavery as a historical period refers to the institutionalized system of enslavement, particularly the transatlantic system from 16th to the 19th centuries, or the 1500s to the 1800s. And it kind of overlaps a little bit. Not overlapping, but it predates the 16th century a little bit. But from a legal standpoint, from an actual overall structure based on the colonies that the Spanish or Portuguese, obviously the English, so on and so forth, and other areas, mind you, put into effect. Okay. The key characteristics. Now, notice the key characteristics are very different from what we saw previously. Okay. So first we have the scale and economy. This was a global economic engine built on forced labor, primarily in plantations, mines, and domestic service. All right. Global economic engine. A well-oiled machine, a system, right? Racialization. Now, notice this didn't come up when I was talking about chattel slave, being a chattel slave. That didn't come up because the racialization is based on a system, all right? Unlike earlier systems, reading the attachment to racialization, unlike earlier systems, it was codified along racial lines. African ancestry became a legal basis for enslavement. Now, here's the thing about that, though. African ancestry only meant that you looked like you were from Africa. This is what people don't understand about the system. It's a global economic engine because the people who look like me were found what? Globally. When you can corral all these people and send them off to places that they were not from, you can say that you were there originally. Well, what are you talking about? We don't see these people here. You must have came from Africa. We didn't see you here. These are things that matter. These are things that have a profound effect societally, relationship-wise, when we're talking about race, racism, and the system known as chattel slavery. A global economic engine means they can pull you from anywhere and send you where they need you, not where you're from. That's the whole point of colonizing an area. Okay? And when you have people in the area that can only think the way they think that things are going to happen, i.e. being a chattel slave doesn't necessarily mean that you're a chattel slave based on purely on what you look like. Primarily before that, it was criminals and war. That's for centuries. That's how people became slaves. A lot of times, conquering, yeah, but that conquering normally came across, with some type of violence, right? You didn't just walk in there and just think you're going to encounter some kind of violence. It might be minor resistance, but violence nonetheless. And you wind up being a prisoner of war, a prisoner of conflict, right? And they did with you whatever. But when we're talking about chattel slavery, a lot of the places these people were pulled from, okay, the people that were still left there were still there, right? But their cultures changed a little bit, okay. So that's the whole point of racialization in the system known as chattel slavery. That's what made it extremely unique. All you had to do was represent some type of phenotype, and you're gone. Okay, and then there was laws to back that up. Now, granted, I probably will not be able to go through this all today, which is fine. Again, this is why I do this every week, because it's you can't give up everything in 1 hour. I guarantee you, especially if you wanna have some type of breakdown of what you're talking about. Legal codification. Laws across colonies and later U.S. states formalized that enslaved indigenous peoples. Because if you were from Mesoamerica, you were enslaved as well for a long time. And their descendants were chattel property. Okay? And again, the laws in terms of your attachment to that title, chattel property, was completely different than any other time in human history. Already we're talking about people who look a certain way getting enslaved automatically, no questions asked. Automatically. Right? Generational impact. And this crosses over into epigenetics. It created multi-generational bondage that was central to economic, political, and social structures. When people say everything's about race, why is everything about race? Well, that's why. There are generations of people who are not indigenous, who are not African, that were affected by this. There was a positive and negative dynamic here. You can't just have one and not the other, especially when you're talking about people. Right? Time frame. It began in the late 1400s with the Portuguese and Spanish colonial expansion. Blah, blah. People need to understand, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they were dominating the Atlantic Ocean and therefore the trade west of west of Europe for a while. That's why people were trying to find, ways to reach, the Silk Road and things of that nature without having to deal with the Spanish and the Portuguese. And I think this also had to tie into what was going on with the Crusades and things of that nature. They were trying to hammer out a road to the Silk Road, and trying to go through Persia and things of that nature to establish trade routes where they, again, did not have to deal with the Spanish and the Portuguese. So it's all based on greed, and considering what basically codified what is known as racism, which was the Vatican and the Church. And that should tell you everything about greed, right? So let's talk about the time frames real quick, if you didn't know about this. It began in the late 1400s, as I mentioned. The height of it was the 17th and 18th century, so we're talking about 1700s. English, French, Dutch, and others fully engaged, right? And we're not just talking about Turtle Island, also known as North America. We're not talking about South America, just South America. We're not talking about Mesoamerica as a whole, which stretches from, the southern tip of South America all the way up into Mexico, what is now Mexico. We're not just talking about that. We're talking about Australia. We're talking about India. We're talking about, obviously, sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, kind of. Well, the Ottoman Empire was not, they weren't having that shit. Actually, the Ottoman Empire and transatlantic slave trade were both going into sub-Saharan Africa. But yeah, that was the height of it, right? The 16th, 17th centuries. 1600s, 1700s. And for the U.S., 1800s was really the early mid 1800s was phenomenal. And it ended gradually. Chattel slavery as an institution, as a system, ended with a gradual abolition in the 19th century. Of course, the U.S. abolishing it in 1865. Now, again, the 13th Amendment abolishes chattel slavery. It does not abolish slavery. Right, and this ties into why there were so many vagrancy laws, black codes, things of that nature going on in the South. During Andrew Johnson's reign as president. I can't stand that asshole. If there's one man I could just pummel with my own hands. Yeah, so that's why they have these codes, because chattel slavery was abolished, but slavery was not. So they had to figure out a way to get those people back in bondage so they can take advantage of them economically, right? But yeah, right. Okay, so just to summarize the key difference from a chattel slave in a period of time known as chattel slavery. Okay. Chattel slave focus. All right, the focus on the difference here is the individual's legal property status. Hold on, I'm sorry. Let me get this back up here for you. There you go. The individual's legal property status, right? That's chattel slave. The entire historical racialized, again, that's the term, that's the key term here, racialized and institutional system of a hereditary property bondage, especially in the Americas. All right, there's that. Right. Example usage, and it's using sentences here. She was sold as a chattel slave in Charleston in 1802. Okay, that's the now version. I mean, you can also go back to how the Romans had slaves, and how the Egyptians had slaves, and what was known as the Mongols, and things of that nature, and how they dealt with societies that they ran through and conquered and stuff like that. That 1802 usage here is a little misleading, because that individual as a chattel slave automatically insinuates that, since it's 1802, automatically insinuates that this individual is either African or indigenous, or Afro-indigenous, right? They have some type of feature that points to them as being from sub-Saharan Africa, right? So that's a little misleading, because if they would say she was sold as a chattel slave in Mesopotamia, right, or a chattel slave in ancient Egypt, during the third dynasty or whatever, or something like that. That'll be a little different because, again, the parameters were completely different. If you're talking about 1802, when we clearly just talked about the 16th and 17th century as being the height of, right? There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. All right, we have to be careful, but again, accuracy is important. Accuracy is important. All right, so we're going to definitely the quote used in chattel slavery, the period, right? So example given, chattel slavery in the American South fueled the cotton economy before the Civil War. All right, again, very, very vanilla. To expound on that, since what is known as chattel slavery actually began in Barbados, like from a legal standpoint, that's the 1600s. You could say chattel slavery built the whole sugar industry. Chattel slavery was used as a breeding mechanism in some states, some colonies, because of that system, right? To expound on that, right? There was a lot of stuff that went down. There are a number of books that you can read about that, folks. If you are if you're an African American, if you're a black person, I would highly suggest that you make sure you come in there with a strong mind, because it's really gonna mess with you. It's really gonna mess with you. And folks who say I'm just bringing this stuff up, look, it's generational. The relationship we have right now, black folks and non-black individuals across a multitude of array of hues, so to say. Epigenetics is real. Generational trauma is real. Societal trauma is real. Right? If you're putting people in position of power just because they look a certain way, even though it goes against everything that you need as a human being to survive and thrive. Yeah. Moving on. All right. So, it gave me a code, and I'm gonna pass that on to my my tech buds so they can do something with that. And this is the interesting thing right here. Hold on, let me pull it up so you can see it. It reads, hold on. It reads, think of chattel slavery as the forest, the whole system, the forest, and chattel slaves as the trees, right? The individuals within it, right? And you need also understand that, when you say chattel slavery as the forest, well, that's a very particular forest, right? For instance, the redwoods in California, that's a completely different forest as opposed to, a forest full of, pine trees, cedar trees, oak trees, right? Each forest, okay, has its own system of trees, so to say. If you know anything about the root systems that connect, each forest has its own system, so to say. So the ecosystem, quote unquote, when you're talking about chattel slavery, the system is going to be extremely unique, right? So those trees within it are going to have a set understanding, so to say, in terms of their environment. The environment is completely different for redwoods as opposed to, you know what I'm saying? That's interesting, but we have to think about that a little more deeply, all right? So let's talk about the etymology of chattel itself, right? The origin of the word. Again, folks, I'm the Duet Ninja. I explain shit. And if you want to understand the world around you better, you need to understand the terminologies and the words utilized to explain this world to you. Okay? So the etymology of the word chattel, and it's going to be like a duh moment for you, right? So the origin is Middle English. It was spelled C-H-A-T-E-L. Also spelled cattle, C-A-T-E-L. Yeah, exactly. And from the old French chattel, meaning property, goods, cattle with two T's, right? And from the Latin origin, capitale, right? Or property, stock, principle with an A, right? related to kaput, meaning head. Okay. But the connection to cattle, which is where, the whole I own you type of situation comes into play. Both chattel and cattle share the same root because livestock was historically a major form of movable property and wealth, right? You got a lot of things done with livestock, whether it was towing something, clearing property, tilling the soil so you can grow things. There's a whole slew of things that went along with, normally cattle, right? Movable property, wealth. So a lot of tribes, a lot of nomads, whatnot, would pass on their cattle, their livestock to their children and their families. It was utilized as currency. I mean, a whole bunch of different things. It was very, very important for society, right? Over time, chattel, chattel, came to mean any movable property. Any movable property. You see where this is going. And tragically, during chattel slavery, the period, right, human beings were classified in the same category, which tells you, again, how people were used as chattel slaves prior to colonialism was completely different than the period known as chattel slavery. And this reinforces that. All right. Human beings were classified in the same category during chattel slavery, the period. Okay. Now there's a shift in meaning. Here we go with the legality. All right. By the 17th to 18th centuries in English legal and economic contexts, chattel, chattel, was explicitly used in law to classify enslaved Africans, enslaved indigenous, Afro-indigenous individuals, and their descendants as personal property, equivalent to objects or livestock. Okay? All right, so the shift was the 17th, 18th centuries, also known as the 16 and 1700s. Okay, and again, we'll get to the legality here in just a second. So a recap, again, the key difference, right, in a chattel slave and chattel slavery, the institution, is that, an individual legally defined as property, right? Any period, various societies prior to colonialism, being a chattel slave was something that was not unique, right? It was being a chattel slave was something that went on for again, thousands upon thousands of years. That is not a hyperbole. Literally thousands upon thousands of years. Okay. Chattel slavery, the institution now, this is very unique. The institutionalized, racialized, and hereditary slavery system. And if you know what hereditary means, you understand how being racialized played a role into, being born in and forever being. Okay. And this, especially 16th to 19th century Americas, plural. So North, Central, South, right? Time scope is the 15 to 1800s specifically. This is a specific time period. Why is it specific? Because it was racialized. Okay. And again, I'm not race baiting. This is the history lesson, folks. If you have a problem with that, then you need to stop talking about the Constitution in ancient Europe in the first place. Chattel slavery shaped the economies of the Caribbean and the American South. That is not a hyperbole. Again, that is not a joke. That is just straight up, folks. The wealthiest people in the world right now that did not come out of Europe. Well, hold on, I can't say that. I mean, there are people who walk this planet right now that have ties to Constantinople and the peoples who were around for the beginning of the Vatican Church, things of that nature. People who obtained a god amount of wealth during the Crusades, stuff like that. Their descendants are still walking this planet. They still have access to all that wealth. People who were attached to the Third Reich that were involved in those raids. The museums and all these other things. I mean, a lot of stuff got taken, and people established a lot of wealth off of that. If you are not from that ilk, so to say, and you are from the American South, your ancestors, you can trace your ancestry back to the Mississippi Delta, to the coastal South Carolina, Charleston area, Virginia, obviously going up into what is New York. Canada, things of that nature. If you could trace your lineage back to that, if you're not a wealthy individual, I'll be surprised. Okay, this is the importance of that establishment. All right. Chattel slavery, the period, was unlike any other time in human history when we're talking about societal relationships. Okay. All right. So now we get into the legality. All right. So early legal use of chattel, quote unquote chattel, with a capital C. All right. So we're getting to the meat and potatoes here. All right. So medieval England and Europe. So the 1100s to the 1500s. So the 12th century to the 16th century. Chattel, quote unquote, referred to movable property, livestock, furniture, tools, goods, sometimes leasehold land. Okay. It was a very broad term. Okay. Common law distinguished between real property and chattels, right? So everything movable, transferable, all right? And real property obviously is tangible, like land, buildings, blah blah blah. All right, so understand something. There was no inherent racial meaning. Why do you think that is? If there was no inherent racial meaning, and we're talking about the 1100s to the 1500s for almost 400 years. Why is that, I wonder? Because it wasn't racialized yet. Okay. All right. Transition to human property. Here we go. All right. You can thank the Portuguese and the Spanish for this, folks. You can thank the Portuguese and the Spanish for this. And oddly enough, the Portuguese and the Spanish, based on the relationship with those who came into that area prior to them, prior to the 1400s to the 1500s, prior to the Inquisition and all that other stuff, was Arab, Moors. All right, so the descendants of those individuals were the ones who created Portugal, Spain, and all this other shit. No lie. All right, this influence is influence, folks. You can look at the architecture, even the language, in some way, in shape or form. And I mean, it's not overly obvious, but yeah. All right. So, but more importantly, all right. So, as Europeans expanded into Africa and the Americas, the legal classification of enslaved persons merged with the existing chattel property category. Okay, in Iberian colonial law, enslaved Africans were often cataloged alongside livestock and other goods in estate records. Right. So here's when the transition starts to come over, because the Spanish and the Portuguese, again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, they dominated the Atlantic Ocean. Their naval power was unmatched for a very long time. Unmatched. In fact, before England got into the game, Spain was getting ready to go up there and conquer. They had an armada on the way. So is what it is. I wonder how that would have played out if they actually would have taken over that area of the world. I wonder how that would have played out. Anyway, so here we go. Entry into English colonial slave codes. Now, this is what Americans are more familiar with, right? The English came over here and did their business and really put their foot down, blah 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 blah. They weren't the only ones, right? Spain was already on the West Coast in California for the most part, going up the Mississippi and shit like that. So it is what it is. First use in English America was the mid 1600s. Okay, so English colonists in Barbados and Virginia began codifying the status of African and indigenous enslaved people as chattel to strip them of personhood and make their status transferable to livestock or like livestock. Okay. Key examples. Now I want you guys to pay attention to this right here, folks. This is where this is where the whole idea of race and racializing humanity really took a major step. Okay, Barbados slave code, 1661. I have a professor actually on video that talks about that. formally declared enslaved Africans as chattels, chattels personal for life, inheritable by the owner's heirs. So you had no way out. If the family who purchased you had children, even if you had children while you were enslaved, your child and you will be passed on to their children if something happens to their parents. There was no way out of this. For life. For life. That's chattel slavery. 1661. That's when that hit. Boom. Anybody who looked like me, even if you were from Honduras, if you had these features, you were screwed. Life. And if you're born in that situation, you had no clue what your culture was prior to that. You had no clue. You had no clue what your parents, what culture your parents came from. Hell, you didn't even know truly where they came from geographically, because it all was based on what you looked like, not the language you spoke. None of that. Okay. Now let's move ahead 44 years, excuse me. Virginia slave codes. 13 colonies. Right? All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves shall be held to be real estate. But in practice, they were also treated as chattels personal for transactions and inheritance purposes. The paradox: legally, they could be real property for taxation, right? Or chattel for sale, depending on what benefited the owner. You had no possibilities of escaping this shit. None. This is not a boo-hoo, poor me type of situation, folks. This is history. And if you feel bad about this, because this happened to black people and all sorts of stuff, if you feel bad about it, don't. Learn from it. Don't feel bad about it. Learn from it. Okay? Don't think that history doesn't repeat itself, ladies and gentlemen. Don't. Legal effects. Right? So hereditary status, transferability, no legal recourse, and economic integration. Okay? Hereditary status. By defining people as chattels, their children automatically became property, ensuring generational enslavement, also known as generational trauma. Moving on. Owners could sell, mortgage, and this is transferability. Owners could sell, mortgage, gift, or bequeath enslaved people exactly as they could livestock or furniture. You were not human. This is why these lynchings that were going on for hundreds of years, mind you. Which anyway, this is why these folks had their children out there having a picnic, watching a human being being strung up by their neck, being shot to pieces, cooked alive, taking home pieces of their body as souvenirs. And I'm not talking about, somewhere, that's now a third world country. I'm talking about the United States of America. I'm talking about the colonies. No legal recourse. Enslaved individuals had no standing in court. They could not sue, testify, or legally marry. This is why the whole thing about the Irish went through the same thing is crap. Because people got together, there were indentured servants in Barbados that got together and wrote a letter, which kind of tripped this whole thing in motion, so to say. They wrote a letter to Cromwell, I believe it was, And yeah, I think it was Cromwell. And basically, so long story short, they wrote a letter saying that, hey, we're white. What the hell is going on here? Why we being treated like these people? Why are we having to work alongside these people? There was no way in the world enslaved African individuals or indigenous individuals, one, would probably have the capability of writing a letter, two, it leaving the colonies in the first place, and thirdly, being read and brought up in court. Like, hey, you got a point. We can get more. We can get more of these individuals to be on our side, and just enslave all these other people, because there's a lot more of them than us. The global population on this planet, ladies and gentlemen, has always been overwhelmingly indigenous. Always. What is known as quote unquote white people started out very, very small. And the only reason that categorization grew was because they start bringing in other people. They start bringing in Spanish. If you had a certain skin tone, I believe it was like a paper bag test or whatever the hell they used to call that shit. So they bring in other peoples, right? They had to bring other people in legally. Why? Because when you have people mating, when you have people bringing an offspring into this world, the dominant feature was always sub-Saharan African and or indigenous. Always. Always. This is why it was illegal for quote unquote white women to even date outside of their race. Race traders. Because these people understand. No, you dirty, you know. It's not even the societal backlash. It's the fact that being quote unquote white wouldn't matter anymore because you don't look white. And I've said this before, folks. If the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa truly wanted to go up in Europe and eliminate what is known as white people, all they would have to do was go up there and just mate with white women. In 3 to 5 years, what is known as white people will be decimated because it's based on a political categorization, not a geobiological one, so to say. But that didn't happen now, did it? No, it didn't, because it wasn't necessary. It's funny how a lot of these indigenous civilizations already had ideas on how to survive and thrive through teamwork, minding your own damn business, having a connection with the universe. Funny, isn't it? And lastly, economic integration, right? So the value of enslaved people was recorded in property, inventories, and used as collateral for loans. Generational wealth. Generational wealth. Okay. Right. And I got 12 minutes here. Number 5, cementing the racial element, right? Again, this talking about chattel slavery and why that period of time was so unique. Okay. Because being a chattel slave dates all the way back before Mesopotamia, right? Before a lot of things happened in this world that were actually written down. Right. So by the late 17th century, the late 1600s, chattel, the term in colonial American law was no longer a neutral property category. It became racialized property law. This, ladies and gentlemen, is also why police officers protect property. This is why police officers protect property. The Supreme Court said themselves that they have no obligation to protect you. They have an obligation to protect property because the source of what we know as police officers came from slave patrols. It was an easy transition. Just look at the badge. Okay. African ancestry became the defining criterion for being classified as a chattel slave. African ancestry. What makes one an African? Nose, lips, eye structure, hair. Of course, skin tone. But more importantly, yeah, all right. If you notice, if you go back up here to the Virginia slave codes, it was, and this is 1705, so not too far from the late 1600s, all Negro mulatto. Right, so these slave owners who were having, unprotected sex, which I guess was the norm then, with the enslaved women, a lot of times very young women, right, and Indian slaves, quote unquote, shall be held to be real estate, right? This is why, right? It cemented that shit. Quote unquote, white colonists could be indentured servants temporary, but black Africans and their descendants were permanently chattel. That cemented it, right? That there was the divide. There was a divide, and it would stay that way because people made a lot of fucking money off of this, man. A lot of money. All right, now the aftermath and legacy, right, of chattel slavery, the period, because the whole idea of black Africans being, seen as chattel slaves was because of the racialization of, right. So the aftermath and legacy of, right, is presented here. Even after abolition, the language of chattel, quote unquote, persisted in legal history and property law discussions. Okay. Today, the term chattel, quote unquote, survives in property law, chattel mortgage, right? But its association with slavery remains a stark reminder of how legal language can dehumanize, right? We got into that already. Yep. Again, the Barbados Slave Code. Those 1661, 1662, and 1705. So actually in 1662, there was a Virginia hereditary slave law, right? And this is what made, really solidified the whole thing about your children will be, right? The whole mulatto thing. Status follows a mother, partus sequitur ventrum, I believe. Enslaved children automatically inherit their mother's chattel status. This is another reason why they didn't want black men having sex with white women, because if you're a white woman and you had a child by a black man, by that law, your child could be considered white. If they're light enough, they can get away with it, and that transpires into a whole other thing. That transpires. What I mean by that is, there are actually African Americans in this country that look so much the part of being white that they completely cut off their black side of their family, right, and try to live their life as a white person, straighten their hair out, and all other stuff, assimilated really, their vernacular, the tone in which they talked. Yeah. This happened a lot, folks. This happened a lot. Survival's real. And some of these people actually sold out folks too, man. Now it's when you put in those conditions, man, when you have to survive, you'll do anything. All right. 1730s and 1770s, you have an expansion of economic entrenchment, right? All 13 colonies have legal statutes defining enslaved Africans as chattel. Chattel status becomes central to credit systems. Again, generational wealth. All right, enslaved people used as collateral for loans, and if they're able to be passed on from generation to generation, and you can get these individuals to have children and all this other stuff. I mean, it didn't necessarily cost money to force people to have sex and have a child, right? And you can really bring in a nice wad of cash, so to say, if that enslaved woman had. That enslaved woman had, 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. If she had twins and triplets or whatever, man, that's one hell of a payday. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but that's the way it was. So yeah, the 13 colonies brought that was the 1730s to the 1770s, right at the cusp of the Revolutionary War. 1787, obviously the U.S. Constitution. Avoids the word slavery, but embeds protections for slaveholders. 3/5 compromise, fugitive slave clause, right? And state laws continue to use "quote unquote" chattel in reference to enslaved persons. Okay. 1800s, peak of chattel slavery, right? So plantation economies in the South rely on enslaved people as the most valuable form of property. This is why these people had insurance on their heads. This is why, again, there was things called breeding colonies, worth more than all U.S. factories, railroads, and banks combined. I'm sorry, did you know? Worth more than all U.S. factories. Hold on, let me pull it up so you can see it. Worth more than all U.S. factories, railroads, and banks collectively, combined. At the peak of chattel slavery, folks. At the peak of chattel slavery, right? And just a note. If the people who own these factories today, who own the railroads today, who own these banks and financial institutions today, will shave 2 to 3% of their annual over 2 years, will set this whole country straight. Because clearly their existence hinges on the backs of my ancestors. But these people just wanted the wealth. They wanted the cash, the status. They didn't care about people who were white, clearly, because there were a lot of poor white people in this country too. It was never about you. It's about them fattening their pockets. But you're so caught up in the racialization, right? You were getting your own way just so black people and indigenous individuals suffer. Clearly, look at how you vote. Look at your schools. Clearly. All right, I'm going to get into the abolitionism. Don't need to. All right. Parallel development. I think I'll jump in that next. Well, I might jump in that. Who knows? Who knows? All right. But yeah, this is just a recap of what we already went through. Okay. All right. So quick takeaway. Linguistically, chattel, quote unquote, started neutral. Right. It narrowed to include humans in colonial law. All right. Returned to a non-human legal term, right, post-abolition. All right. And legally, right, colonial powers weaponized the property term just to justify, codify, and perpetuate the racialized hereditary system of chattel slavery. Again, the system, not the existence, the system in which people existed, right? But that system dictated how you existed. Because before colonialism, right, before chattel was utilized to describe a system, people were used as chattel slaves, but it was chattel slavery in Roman times, chattel slavery in France, chattel slavery in Spain, chattel slavery in, Mozambique. Like, I mean, chattel slave, being a chattel slave was everywhere because that did happen. But racialization required an understanding of race, which was a European existence, a European invention that was purely based on politics. That required a biology to be the distinguishing factor, so to say. Okay? So that's what chattel slavery was. It was a system based on race. And that system required race to be created. Okay, and that's how obviously all this wealth that has been produced technically since the late 1400s. That's how all this wealth was accumulated, right? And then it was sped up in this astronomical way with U.S. based chattel slavery, the transatlantic slave trade in itself, Brazil, Venezuela. Spain, Portugal, Poland, I mean, on and on and on, France, on and on and on and on. This is what chattel slavery was. Okay. It was the springboard into the, not only the Industrial Revolution, but into I guess you can say an economic and wealth system that it meant the end of a lot of cultures, 'Cause there were cultures that went extinct because of this. Extinct. When you can separate the people from their culture and that culture is not utilized anymore, what happens? It goes extinct. It goes extinct. It's like there was this. I'll leave you guys with this. There was this. It was, I don't know if it was an experiment or it was a discovery, but a child was in an enclosed room with no lights for an extended period of time. I'm not quite sure how long, but basically their eyes stop working. Right? Organically, if you don't use something of your body, it will not know how to function. Right? The connection, your neurons will not work properly. They will not connect properly. They will not grow properly. They will not progress properly. So the utilization will not be there whenever you do get introduced to whatever it is. Sound, light, vibrations, energy. And this is the same thing that happens with people and their culture. When you separate a group of people from their culture that has been around hundreds, potentially thousands of years, it goes away. It's gone. There is no more. So sometimes if something comes to you or something that you're not necessarily familiar with sounds good to you, right? It's like, wow, it triggers something. That's that genetic code. That's that genetic marker from your ancestors that was taken out or taken away from you a long time ago. It just so happens there was a coincidence in time where that triggered something. Okay, so yeah, this is what chattel slavery was and is. Noun form, period of time. A noun form was around thousands of years prior to the understanding of, not the terminology, of the understanding of how people were treated. It was around thousands upon thousands of years before colonialism. When colonialism came around, that's when we had a system in place, legally, socially, all right, that sped up what is known as capitalism now, basically. Okay. So thanks for checking out the Duet Ninja Dojo. I appreciate you guys. I'll see you guys next Friday. Shout out to Shane and Ant, everybody who came on board today. I appreciate you guys. And for the love of God, folks, expand your mind. There's no better time than the present, especially before everything is taken away from you. Because that's how you're going to get through this life. Understanding. Y'all be good.
Leadership sets the stage, ladies and gentlemen, especially when you're talking about those who they are leading. This is the danger that people don't want to talk about when we're talking about entertainment. Money suppresses a lot of things when you're weak. And that weakness comes from the fact that a lot of these corporations that are paying people to go out there and buy shit are suppressing the monies that you can obtain. Because there is no ethical leadership when money rules the table. Is it capitalism's fault? I don't think so. This is an individual choice.
Hi, I go by the Duet Ninja, and I'll be on that bullshit. Word to the wise. If you feel as if the world revolves around you, then you must fail to realize the galaxy is never bigger than the universe. Understand your orbit before you get too close to the fucking sun.